But this, of course, could rapidly lead to a confrontation, that could put the UK directly at war with Russia.
The Defence Secretary John Healey has suggested that British troops could be deployed on the ground in Ukraine for training. He told The Times, who were the only media outlets accompanying him on the trip, he said that the UK needed to make the training a better fit for what the Ukrainians need, and we will look wherever we can to respond to what the Ukrainians want. This comes after Ukrainian President Zelensky admitted that his forces cannot retake Crimea and the Donbass. The only way they can force Russia out is through Western diplomatic pressure. So the prevailing mood here is, Martin, that they're going to get where Russia is now is where Russia's going to stay in the short and medium term. And then the question is that a victory for Putin? Is that something that the West can collectively live with? And can the West guarantee the security of the rest of Ukraine in a way that won't stop Putin coming back for some more in a couple of years? Has this all been, we were told for 2 years Ukraine could win, and now we've been told for the last 6 months Ukraine can't win. What do you make of the trajectory of this conflict?
Well, Zelensky has basically admitted, hasn't he, in the last few days that they can't hold on to the eastern part of Ukraine. We've now pledged £225 million of support, and boots on the ground in Ukraine. If John Healey is to be taken at his word, that we will send troops into Ukraine to train their troops, which is a flip of Operation Interflex, where we were training them in this country. The cynic in me would say that when things are not going very well at home, and they're certainly not going very well at home, you try to pivot towards your foreign policy, and this is a good way of trying to make us look like leaders again, and we're taking the initiative. But everybody knows that the Ukraine war is waiting a major development in the White House, and that really everything that everyone else is doing could be undermined, could be rendered irrelevant, really, by the arrival of Donald Trump.
Or actually, the other point is that they are moving, as Martin is saying, because they know Donald Trump is coming.
Maybe.
Are you struck, Ashley, by how the change in tone there's been, that for a couple of years there was lots of confidence? I remember experts on this programme saying, this war will be over by spring, and I think that was in 2023, the classic "over by Christmas" line that there was at the end of the beginning of the First World War. Are you surprised about the trajectory of this conflict? And then what are we going to take out of it at the end, Ashley, when we look at this? Has Putin lost, or has Putin won? I suppose would be one question, one simplistic way of looking at it.
Yeah, I imagine that they're contractually obliged to say that a war will be over by Christmas. Yeah. But I think they probably realize that it's time to be realistic and secure what one has. And at the moment, they seem to be jostling for the best position from which to come to the bargaining table. But I mean, it's a tricky balance to strike as well, with training at home versus quote unquote training abroad, if that's what it is. I imagine they want to keep off of UK soil as much as possible. That's always risky. It's always a better position for a country to be in, to be supplying weapons and to stay out of the path of destruction as much as possible. But on the other hand, if they don't want to be humiliated, they may have to commit some troops to Ukraine in some form. But this, of course, could rapidly lead to a confrontation, that could put the UK directly at war with Russia. So it's very, very tricky. The war must go on, but it can't go on because it's so risky, and the possibility of destruction is so great. I imagine that, it's time for some reality and just to, secure what one has and come to the bargaining table in the best position possible, because the risks are just enormous.
But the risk comes in that bargaining, Martin, because one of the things that we might have to do as the West is we might have to welcome Ukraine into NATO as a way. Russia keeps Crimea and Donbass, and then Ukraine gets put into NATO, which means if Russia does anything else, we're at war with Russia.
Yes.
And I guess the question for some people, we've had people on this show saying we think we've wasted money, we've spent millions and millions of pounds supporting Ukraine when we shouldn't have done. We've had the very opposite view, saying we've not supported them enough and we've let Russia get into this position. We should have spent more money, we should have supported more. Where do you stand? Would you be happy for us to be guaranteeing the security of Ukraine against Russia with what would amount to British military capacity if they join NATO?
No, I don't think I would, and it would be
Really?
But yeah, I think it would be. If you look at that region, we were there in 2012. It was really hugely complex. I was there for a football match, watching England play Ukraine, and the entire stadium was chanting Russia. And when you first heard the chant, you're thinking, what are they saying? What are they saying? We were expecting this massively pro-Ukraine. It was an away match for England. And we were expecting this massively nationalistic feeling. And you could hear this word, and you think, that really sounds like Russia. That really, and it was.
And this is 2012, so this is before the invasion of the Crimea.
This is before. And so that's, and if you look at this, Putin went into that part of eastern Ukraine because it was becoming a rival in terms of supplying energy to the West. So when you're asking, is it a victory for Ukraine? Is it a victory for Putin? I think it's a victory for Putin if he ends up in control of the part of Ukraine that was a threat to Russian energy supply.
Right. Putin's doing a phone-in, bizarrely enough, this morning, which we'll be covering later on in the programme, where he gets people to ask questions of him. You can imagine they are the most strenuously checked questions in the history of phone-ins. Vladimir Putin has begun his annual phone-in broadcast, where he answers questions sent in by the Russian public on state television. They can ask him anything they like, provided it says what a great man he is. I would imagine. I could be being unfair to Vladimir Putin.
I think you're being really unfair.
With the backdrop of a high-ranking military general being assassinated in Moscow only a few days ago, how does he maintain a projection of strength? Times columnist and Russia watcher Edward Lucas has been watching this annual pre-Christmas event. We can speak to him now. Morning, Edward.
Morning, Tig. Yes.
Is this
it's not actually not totally easy questions. Just as I switched off to come onto this show, someone asked him quite a difficult question from the Kursk region, which is under partial Ukrainian control because of Ukraine's offensive there in the summer, saying, Mr. President, when am I going to be able to go home? And when are you going to deal with this invasion? So that's actually quite a tough one for Putin.
So what's the process? I'm really interested in that because what's the process by which these are checked, these questions, do you think? Because does he want to have an opinion on Kursk that he wants to get out there? I mean, this can't be... Maybe I've misjudged the Russian establishment. This can't be a sort of free-for-all, ask what you like.
Well, they have millions and millions of questions come in, and it's a combined sort of phone-in and press conference. So you get people who are sort of quite well-known journalists standing there with you're allowed to take one sheet of A4 in with you. That's because in past years, people came with enormous banners saying, I'm from Piddle Trentide, and I want a parish council, I want to ask a question, or big media organisations sort of jostling, saying, I'm from Times Radio, I want to ask a question. And so it's quite a melee. It's moderated by two, one war correspondent and one well-known news anchor this year, and it gives the appearance of being quite unscripted. I think if you wanted to ask a question about Mr. Putin, how many children do you have and how many mistresses, that probably wouldn't come in. Although in this country, that's also a question that can't always be asked. But it's pretty. If you're a Russia watcher like me, this is pretty gripping. And I actually went to the very first one and asked, I think, the first question of any foreign journalist, possibly of any journalist, at the very first Putin press conference. And I slightly wasted it because I said, this is very interesting. Can you guarantee you'll do it again next year?
Oh, no.
It seemed so unusual that I thought I'd just try and get that in, at least get him to commit to doing it. And he said, yes, of course, next question. So that was a bit of a waste. But anyway, it was my sort of nanosecond in history. That was back in, I think, 2000 or 2001.
So I'm interested in this. So could someone ask the question, has this war in Ukraine been a failure? Or will you do a deal with Donald Trump? Or is it acceptable that 500,000 Russians have been killed? Do you have blood on your hands? I mean, how far down the road of genuinely sort of prodding Putin would this go, do you think?
Well, you do get quite different. I mean, you're not allowed to call it a war by law in Russia. You have to call it a special military operation. Otherwise, men come and cart you away. So there are, and the questions are selected by the team, but they give him a chance to deal with quite difficult ones. And he kicked off talking about inflation, which is the big worry in Russia, and there was a rather sort of meandering opening statement, which had a whiff of Soviet planners talking about how much meat and butter consumption per head in Russia is going up or down, and I think one of the problems with being the president of Russia, no one ever interrupts you, so you tend to go on rather.
Yeah.
We had this sort of slightly meandering opening statement, and then the next question I think was on the war, and he said we are advancing, and it's true. He has got basically good news. And he said it's been jolly difficult. We used to be advancing by sort of a few meters at a time. Now we're advancing by kilometers at a time, and we're going to get there. So that was his sort of answer on that. And then there was a very softball question about whether he could reopen a military academy in North Ossetia. And he said, yes, he'd love to. And then some veterans brought a flag on stage, which they'd all autographed from some marine unit in the Far East. So it has a sort of, it's a choreographed theatrical effect, but there are some real elements to it.
Well, you get back and watch it for Edward. It sounds what a fascinating thing to do, a sort of balance of being controlled and just having enough.
And can I just say one thing?
Go on.
He can do 4.5 hours of this without a note. And I wonder how many Western politicians would do a 4-hour semi-unscripted phone-in press conference without a note. It's a sign of his. This is why he's actually pretty popular in Russia, and we should never forget that although we may loathe him, a lot of Russians think he's actually pretty good.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Ed. Always good to hear. Always good to hear something that challenges slightly the status quo of thinking on this sort of stuff. Great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.